Have you ever found yourself staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., exhausted, yet entirely unable to stop your mind from racing? You desperately want to sleep, but your brain is busy replaying an awkward conversation from years ago or catastrophizing about tomorrow. You plead with your mind to shut off, but it refuses. This universal frustration exposes a massive assumption we all secretly carry: I am my thoughts. What I think is who I am. Over 2 millennia ago, the Buddha challenged this deeply ingrained illusion. He posed a radically simple question: if your thoughts truly belong to you, if they were genuinely you, wouldn't you be able to command them? You would simply say, "Stop worrying," and your mind would obey. The fact that you cannot control them proves a liberating truth: you are not your thoughts. The anatomy of a thought. If we establish that you are not your thoughts, then a massive question naturally follows: what exactly is a thought? When a deeply anxious or self-critical thought enters your mind, something like, "I am a complete failure, and everyone knows it," it feels incredibly dense. It feels like a solid block of concrete sitting directly on your chest. Because it carries such heavy emotional weight, we instinctively treat it as an objective fact. We mistake the intensity of the feeling for the truth of the statement. We assume that if a thought hurts this much, it must be an accurate reflection of reality. The Buddha's perspective, however, fundamentally dismantles this illusion of solidity. He taught that thoughts are not concrete structures at all, they are fleeting, conditioned phenomena. To understand this, we need to stop looking at thoughts as physical architecture and start looking at them as internal weather systems. Imagine looking up at a dark, menacing thundercloud. From the ground, it looks solid, heavy, and impenetrable. It blocks out the sun and dominates the sky. But if you were to fly an airplane directly into that cloud, what would you hit? Nothing solid. There is no concrete wall in the sky. You would simply pass through a temporary gathering of water vapor, shifting temperatures, and atmospheric pressure. The cloud only exists because specific, temporary conditions came together at exactly the right time. This is the essence of a core Buddhist principle known as dependent origination, or padikasamuppada. It states that nothing arises independently, everything exists because a web of supporting conditions allows it to exist. Every thought you have is a storm cloud, assembled from various atmospheric ingredients. Let's break down the anatomy of a real-life worry. Imagine you are driving home from work, and a sudden, overwhelming thought hits you: my boss hates me, and I'm going to lose my job. This thought didn't just spontaneously generate out of thin air. It was meticulously constructed by an ecosystem of hidden conditions. What are those conditions? First, the physical trigger: you only slept 4 hours last night, and your central nervous system is frayed. Second, the external catalyst: your boss sent a brief, unpunctuated email earlier that day simply saying, "See me tomorrow." Third, the historical conditioning: you carry a deep-seated childhood wound of never feeling good enough unless you are constantly praised. Finally, the physical sensation: a sudden tightness in your gut that your brain misinterprets as impending doom. If you remove even one of these ingredients, the storm loses its power. If you had slept a full 8 hours, that same email might have just prompted the thought, "Oh, we probably need to review that budget." If you didn't have the childhood habit of seeking validation, you wouldn't immediately jump to the worst-case scenario. The thought is not a reflection of a fundamental truth, it is simply a reflection of your current internal conditions. It is an assembled phenomenon. Furthermore, there is an illusion of continuity that tricks us into taking our thoughts too seriously. We experience a bad mood as a single, uninterrupted block of time. I've been angry all afternoon, we say. But cognitive science and ancient mindfulness practices agree, there is no continuous thought. What we experience as a solid state of mind is actually a rapid-fire sequence of incredibly brief mental moments. A thought arises, lasts for an impossibly short fraction of a second, and vanishes, only to be immediately replaced by the next one. It works exactly like a reel of film in a movie theater. A movie is just a series of static photographs moving at 24 frames per second. The sheer speed of the frames creates the illusion of seamless motion. Similarly, the speed of your mental chatter creates the illusion of a solid, permanent personality trait. When you truly understand the anatomy of a thought, that it is a temporary cloud built on passing conditions, playing out like a fast-moving movie reel, its absolute authority over you begins to crack. You realize you don't have to fight a cloud, and you don't have to believe every frame of the movie. The trap of fake observation. So, if thoughts are just passing weather, the logical next step is to simply watch the clouds roll by, right? It sounds easy in theory. Just observe your mind. You hear this instruction everywhere today, from upscale yoga studios to corporate wellness seminars. But here is the uncomfortable truth. When most people try to observe their thoughts, they end up doing the exact opposite. They fall into a subtle, incredibly common trap without even realizing it. They engage in fake observation. Imagine you are sitting in heavy traffic, already late for a crucial meeting, and someone aggressively cuts you off. Instantly, a hot flash of anger spikes in your chest, and your jaw clenches. You remember that you are supposed to be mindful, so you attempt to observe the anger. But what does that actually look like in your head? It usually sounds something like this. Okay, I'm angry. Why am I angry? Well, that guy was a complete jerk. But wait, I shouldn't be this angry. I meditate. I read books about inner peace. Why is my heart still racing? Am I doing this mindfulness thing wrong? I need to calm down right now. If I walk into the office like this, I'm going to ruin the meeting. This internal monologue is a perfect example of what goes wrong when we misunderstand mindfulness. You believe you are observing the anger, but in reality, you are just launching a second, separate train of thought directly into the first one. You are not observing the emotion, you are interrogating it, judging it, and wrestling with it. You are wearing a spiritual costume, using the language of self-awareness to mask a profound state of internal resistance. In this state, you are piling new judgments on top of the original trigger, generating more noise and more mental agitation. You think you are pouring water on a fire, but you are actually dousing it in gasoline. You are still completely tangled up in the content of the thought, constantly asking what the feeling says about you. So, what is true observation? The Buddha was incredibly precise about this. He used a specific term to describe the right kind of awareness, pajanati. It translates roughly to direct knowing or immediate, bare recognition without any conceptual elaboration. It is the purest form of noticing, entirely stripped of the why, the how, and the should. To truly understand pajanati, think about how you experience rain. Imagine you are sitting in your living room, reading a book, and you suddenly hear the rhythmic patter of water against the glass window. In that exact fraction of a second, you don't need to analyze the barometric pressure outside. You don't need to form a moral opinion about the weather. You don't sit there and think that it shouldn't be raining today or that this is unfair to your weekend plans. You simply hear the sound, and you know, it is raining. The knowing is instantaneous, silent, and complete. It requires no effort and no narrative. Rain is falling, and you know it. That's the entire process. True mindfulness asks you to treat your internal weather the same way. When anger arises, the instruction is almost startlingly bare. You clearly know that anger is present. When anxiety tightens your throat, you clearly know that anxiety is present. There is no intermediate step between the arising of the feeling and the knowing of it. You are not trying to push the anger away, nor are you inviting it in for tea to aggressively psychoanalyze its origins. You are simply holding up a mirror. A clean mirror doesn't judge the reflection it casts, it just honestly illuminates whatever stands before it, whether it's a beautiful flower or an ugly scar. Modern psychology has actually adopted this ancient wisdom through a highly effective therapeutic tool called cognitive diffusion, a core component of acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT. Diffusion is the practice of untangling yourself from the literal content of your thoughts. Instead of saying, "I am a failure," cognitive diffusion teaches you to step back and note, "I am noticing that I am having the thought that I am a failure." It sounds like a minor semantic shift, but neurologically, it is a massive game changer. It strips the thought of its emotional charge. By shifting from thinking about the thought to simply knowing the thought is there, you starve the fire of its essential fuel. You stop adding your own ego, your own judgments, and your own panic to the equation. And in that quiet, non-judgmental space of pure knowing, something remarkable begins to happen to the thought itself. If you're finding value in this journey toward mental clarity and inner peace, take a quick second to subscribe to Buddha Coha. We explore practical Zen wisdom and mindfulness tools like this every week to help you navigate modern life with a calmer, freer mind. Hit that subscribe button, and let's dive right back into exactly what happens when you create that gap of awareness. The gap where transformation happens. So, we have established what a thought actually is, a passing condition, not a solid truth, and what true observation looks like, pure knowing, not analytical thinking. The pivotal question now is, what exactly happens in real life when that pure, non-judgmental awareness collides with a turbulent emotion? To understand this transformation, we have to look at the mechanics of a standard human reaction. Imagine you are in a meeting, and a colleague suddenly criticizes your work in front of the entire room. In under a second, a biological and psychological chain reaction detonates. Heat flushes your face. Your chest tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, and your jaw locks. Before you have even consciously processed what was said, a voice inside your head is already shouting, aggressively drafting a defense, and listing every mistake that colleague has ever made. In this default state, there is absolutely no distance between you and the feeling of humiliation or anger. You didn't decide to get angry, the anger simply hijacked your nervous system. You didn't have a reaction, you became the reaction. The emotion has full, unhindered access to your vocal cords, your facial expressions, and your decision-making abilities. It is driving the car, and you are locked in the trunk. But what if, right in the middle of that physical flush of heat and mental chaos, a sudden flash of true observation occurs? What if, for just a split second, you experience that direct knowing we discussed earlier? I am furious right now. My chest is tight. Anger is present. In that exact fraction of a second, the entire architecture of your internal world shifts. Where there was previously only one fused, messy experience, you being the anger, there are now two distinct entities in the room, the anger itself, and the awareness that knows the anger is there. By simply acknowledging the presence of the emotion without diving into its storyline, you have created a gap. A tiny, vital space has opened up between the trigger and your response. This concept is beautifully illustrated by the Buddha's famous teaching on the second arrow. According to this wisdom, whenever we experience a hardship, life shoots a first arrow at us. This first arrow represents the unavoidable pain of existence, such as a physical injury, an unexpected loss, or, in this case, a harsh criticism. It hurts, and it is entirely out of our control. However, our immediate, unconscious reaction, the story we spin about how unfair it is, the rage, the bitter plotting of revenge, is the second arrow. We shoot this second arrow into ourselves, multiplying our suffering unnecessarily. The first arrow is simple pain, the second arrow is mental anguish. When you cultivate that gap of pure observation, you are effectively dropping your bow. You still feel the sting of the first arrow, the initial surge of adrenaline and hurt, but you refuse to fire the second arrow, the destructive narrative. You recognize the pain, but you do not amplify it. This isn't just a poetic metaphor, it is a structural reality of how the mind operates. The Abhidhamma, which is the ancient and highly detailed psychological and philosophical framework of Buddhism, describes this mechanism with incredible precision. It states a fundamental law of consciousness: wholesome mental factors and unwholesome mental factors cannot exist in the exact same moment of mind. Mindfulness, or sati, is a wholesome factor. Anger, known as dosa, or greed, known as lobha, are unwholesome factors. They are mutually exclusive. They cannot share the same microscopic instant of consciousness. Therefore, the very moment genuine mindfulness arises to observe the anger, that specific moment of anger has already ended. Mindfulness does not need to wrestle the anger to the ground. It doesn't need to argue with it or forcefully suppress it. Its mere presence is enough to break the unwholesome sequence. It works exactly like turning on a light switch in a pitch-black room. The light doesn't fight the darkness. The darkness simply cannot exist where light is present. In your daily life, this translates into a profound, tangible shift. As you practice this direct knowing, the gap begins to widen. You will still experience the sting of criticism. The heat will still rise in your face. The story will try to spin up. But because awareness registers it immediately, the chain of unconscious reaction is broken. The anger loses its absolute authority. From that wider, more spacious place, you can look at the situation and decide how to act. You might still choose to speak up and defend your work, but you will do so with clarity and intention, rather than lashing out from a place of blind reflex. You move from being a victim of your conditioning to being the author of your choices. This is where true transformation takes root, not in eliminating difficult emotions, but in fundamentally changing your relationship with them. Building the ecosystem of mindfulness. If creating this gap of pure observation is so powerfully transformative, why do so many of us struggle to maintain it? Why is it that we can feel perfectly serene while listening to a guided meditation app for 10 minutes, only to completely lose our temper the moment we step into the kitchen or read a frustrating email? The answer lies in how modern society has fundamentally misunderstood and isolated the practice. Today, we often treat mindfulness as a standalone life hack, a quick psychological vitamin we pop in the morning to optimize our productivity, lower our blood pressure, or make us better corporate competitors. We try to compartmentalize it, separating our 10 minutes of Zen from the remaining chaotic hours of our day. Ancient wisdom, however, tells a completely different story. The Buddha never taught mindfulness in a vacuum. He understood a basic law of nature: you cannot plant a delicate, beautiful seed in highly toxic, depleted soil and expect it to thrive. Mindfulness requires a supporting environment. It does not work as an isolated technique, it requires a deeply rooted ecosystem. In classical Buddhist philosophy, this ecosystem is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. While that might sound like a rigid list of ancient religious commandments, it is actually a highly practical, intricately connected psychological blueprint. It is a system for designing a life that naturally supports clear, effortless observation. We can break this ecosystem down into three vital components: the foundation of outer stability, the compass of intention, and the engine of mental discipline. First, let's look at the foundation of outer stability, which encompasses what the Buddha called right speech, right action, and right livelihood. In our modern, fast-paced context, these concepts are often brushed aside as mere moralistic finger-wagging. We tend to think about what being a good person has to do with watching our thoughts. The answer is absolutely everything. These ethical guardrails are not about pleasing a higher power or following arbitrary rules, they are about profound neurobiological practicality. Imagine trying to deeply observe the subtle, fleeting ripples of your thoughts while living a life full of deceit, aggressive conflict, or exploitation. If you spend your day gossiping behind a coworker's back, lying to your partner, or making a living in a way that actively harms others, your nervous system is going to be in a constant, low-grade state of threat and defense. A mind burdened by guilt, defensiveness, or hidden agendas is like a choppy, turbulent lake during a windstorm. No matter how hard you strain your eyes, you cannot look down and see the bottom. The water is simply too agitated. Ethical living, speaking honestly, acting with integrity, and doing work that adds value rather than causing harm, is the process of calming the wind. It removes the grossest levels of mental agitation from your daily life. It ensures that when you finally pause to observe your mind, you aren't wrestling with the immediate, noisy fallout of your own chaotic choices. Outer peace is the non-negotiable prerequisite for inner stillness. Second, a healthy ecosystem requires a compass, right view and right intention. Without a clear understanding of why you are practicing mindfulness, your observation becomes aimless. In contemporary culture, we often use mindfulness as a coping mechanism to tolerate the intolerable. We meditate so we can endure another 80-hour workweek without burning out. But the original intention of this practice is radically different. It is rooted in the deep understanding that clinging to our fragile sense of ego is the root of our suffering. It is guided by a sincere commitment to letting go and practicing non-harm, which is true compassion, toward ourselves and others. If your intention is simply to feel relaxed, you will abandon the practice the moment observation becomes difficult or brings up uncomfortable memories. But if your intention is genuine liberation and self-understanding, you possess the structural integrity to weather internal storms. You aren't just watching traffic, you know exactly where the road is leading. Finally, this ecosystem is powered by the engine of mental discipline, right effort and right concentration. This is the grit of the practice. Direct knowing doesn't happen accidentally, it requires sustained energy. Right effort is the gentle, persistent willingness to guide the mind back to the present moment for the 10,000th time, without a single ounce of self-loathing or frustration. It is the quiet courage to catch yourself spiraling into anxiety and decide to step out of the story, over and over again. Right concentration is the anchor. It is the ability to gather your scattered mental energy and focus it on one point until the mind becomes steady and luminous. A concentrated mind holds awareness the way a heavy, solid lantern holds a flame steady in a drafty room. It prevents your observation from being instantly blown out by the first breeze of a distracting thought. When you build this ecosystem, when you align your daily actions with integrity, orient your heart toward compassion, and train your focus with gentle persistence, mindfulness stops being a chore. It ceases to be another exhausting item on your daily to-do list. Instead, it becomes the natural, effortless baseline of how you operate in the world. You have cultivated a rich, fertile soil where the gap of awareness can grow deep roots, allowing you to observe even the most terrifying thoughts with unshakable, profound calm. The ultimate freedom, letting go of the observer. If you commit to this practice, if you cultivate the gap of awareness and build a supportive ecosystem of ethical living and mental discipline, the tangible benefits in your daily life will become undeniable. You will catch yourself before sending that aggressively drafted email. The space between a trigger and your reaction will grow wider. Your relationships will inevitably improve, not because the people around you have suddenly changed, but because you are no longer blindly acting out every defensive impulse. You will find more room to breathe, more room to choose, and a profound sense of psychological relief. But for those who continue to walk this path, the practice doesn't stop at simply becoming a calmer person. Eventually, observation begins to turn towards something entirely unexpected, leading to a paradigm-shifting realization. You have spent months or perhaps years watching your thoughts, your anger, your joy, and your anxieties arise and pass away like weather systems. You have firmly established the understanding that you are the sky, and your thoughts are just the clouds. But at a certain depth of practice, the mind does something radical. It turns the mirror of awareness back onto itself. You begin to ask the ultimate question: if my thoughts are just passing clouds, and I am the one standing here observing them, who exactly is the observer? In Western culture, we are deeply attached to the idea of a permanent, unchanging core identity. We imagine that there is a little CEO sitting directly behind our eyes, a fixed, solid self or soul that is pulling the levers of our brain, making the decisions, and enduring the storms of life. We believe that while our thoughts may fluctuate, the watcher remains constant. However, when genuine mindfulness reaches its deepest, most penetrating level, you look for that inner CEO, and you find an empty chair. When you meticulously search for the permanent witness, you do not find a solid, unbroken entity. You realize that the sense of being the one watching is, itself, just another fleeting experience arising in the mind. It comes, and it goes. The act of observing is fluid and shifting, completely devoid of a fixed center. No permanent witness is standing safely on the riverbank watching the stream of consciousness flow by. The watching is actually part of the stream. This is the pinnacle of the Buddha's teaching, famously delivered in the Untitled Sutta, the discourse on the not-self characteristic. He didn't just say that your physical form is not you, or that your fleeting emotions are not you. He went all the way to the very bottom, consciousness itself, the very faculty of knowing, the profound awareness that feels so undeniably like me, even that is conditioned. Even that arises and passes away. Even that is not a permanent self you can hold on to. To the modern ego, this concept of anatta, or not self, sounds absolutely terrifying. It sounds like annihilation, a cold, existential void. If I am not my thoughts, and I am not even the observer of my thoughts, do I even exist? But those who have walked far enough to genuinely touch this realization describe the exact opposite of terror. They describe it as the most intimate, profound, and breathtaking relief of their entire lives. Think about it, the suffering that feels so unbearably heavy, your trauma, your failure, your anxiety, your ruined reputation, is entirely dependent on a solid me to carry it. It rests on the foundation of a contracted, tight, highly defended sense of self. But when that foundation is examined closely under the light of pure observation, it turns out to be empty. It is not empty in a dead, nihilistic, or apathetic way. It is empty in the same way the sky is empty. The sky is vast, boundless, and utterly unbothered. Because it has no solid form, it can hold the most violent, tearing hurricanes and the brightest, most piercing sunlight without ever being damaged, scarred, or altered by either. When there is no longer a contracted self at the center desperately trying to defend its territory, every experience ceases to be a personal wound. Physical pain still hurts, sadness still brings tears, and life still presents complex challenges. But the suffering, the mental anguish, the desperate resistance, the heavy burden of the second arrow, completely dissolves. You are no longer a hostage to the narrative, and you are no longer exhausted from playing the role of the observer. You transition from trying to stand above life to being fully awake and freely immersed within it. This is the ultimate promise of observing your thoughts. It doesn't just change the thoughts, it fundamentally dismantles the illusion of the thinker. The capacity to experience this freedom is not a superpower granted to a chosen few, it is a skill built through patient, fiercely honest practice. It starts exactly where you are. The next time you find yourself lying awake at 2 a.m., exhausted and held hostage by your own racing mind, remember that you do not have to fight the storm. You simply have to notice it. Close your eyes, feel the rise and fall of your chest, and bring your awareness to the present moment. Notice the wandering. Acknowledge the worry. And without a single ounce of self-blame, gently return to the breath. Every time you do this, you weaken the illusion. You crack the foundation of the habit. The path is real, the freedom is vast, and every single step counts. All you have to do is begin.